Coronavirus. What would Jesus do? Thank you for this opportunity to offer some reflections as we approach Christian Aid Week. We live in uncertain and fast-changing times, and what I say today at the end of April may well be heard very differently in a week or two. So much of what I do say has a kind of provisionality about it. I think that the title I've been given is genuinely challenging. What would Jesus do? As followers of Christ, we're called to be where he is. Come, follow me, he says. And we head off into the highways and the byways of the Galilee, hear his teaching, witness his miracles, share in his healing, and break warm, steaming, oven-baked bread, blessed by him. And yet, come, follow me, he says, through arrest and trial, mocking and imprisonment, to a place outside the city wall, where in isolation from family and friends, nails are riven through flesh and bone, and he's hung up to die. We're called to each of these places, but we're also not just to ask, what would Jesus do, as if it were in the past? Our question must also be, what is Jesus doing, and what will Jesus do? In other words, respond to his other invitation to two disciples, come and see right now, and his promise at the end of Matthew's Gospel, remember, I am with you always until the end of the age. Amongst the things that have struck me about recent weeks have been two responses. I've seen lots of people look outwards to care for their neighbours, to be energised, to make a difference, to seek to build community. A great deal of this is fabulous. But at times I've wondered if some of the activity is displacement because perhaps we're too scared to pause, and we need our world to keep rushing on. The other approach is one of interiority. Many of us value stillness and solitude, rooted space and place being important in our lives. But that can also lead to us looking in only on ourselves, anxious about our own little world, what we might have lost, and getting ratty about our churches not being open. And believe me, I've received the letters. Whilst we each react in different ways in a crisis and at different stages in that crisis, it strikes me that somehow we need to find the blend of loving God and loving our neighbour. Loving God through serving our neighbours, and serving our neighbours through being close to God. And in this reflection, I'll explore 4 areas where we might ponder to answer the question, what would Jesus do, or is doing? For I believe he's with the Father, with the suffering, with the poor, and with us all. So, with the Father. As we turn the pages of the Gospels, we repeatedly find Jesus taking himself off to be on his own. Before and after every major event, self-isolation with his Heavenly Father, connecting and being connected until, of course, the crowds come to find him, or the guards arrive in the Garden of Gethsemane. So in our COVID world, Jesus is first attending to God the Father. Following that pattern can for some of us be easier in isolation. For others, it's much harder. Bishop Stephen Cottrell reminded me that leaders of some of the very earliest monastic communities used to say to their novice monks, "Go to your cell and your cell will teach you everything." In isolation, we don't just come face to face with God, we come face to face with ourselves. And for many of us, isolation can become a difficult confrontation. Confrontation with past sin, or the looming possibility of mortality, or the images that stalk the mind and threaten to overwhelm us, even for those of us with good mental health. But Jesus comes and finds us, just as he found his disciples locked away in fear in an upper room, and he breathed on them the gift of life again, an echo of that second creation narrative where God takes the mud of the earth and fashions a human being and breathes into the nostrils of that figure that he has made. And throughout the Gospels, we keep finding Jesus saying to his disciples, "Do not be afraid." For I think this may be a time when we're also being confronted with the big questions of life. They often come to us at times of birth and death, the highs and low points of living. But now the unusual thing is that perhaps lots of people are asking these questions all at the same time. Where am I in the world? What is a good life? What might the future hold? What might be different from what I had regarded as normal? What happens when I die? Perhaps now is the time to find that Sabbath rest in the turmoil, to ponder before God, and to learn to live out the words of the Irish priest-poet John O'Donoghue. This is the time to be slow. Lie low to the wall until the bitter weather passes. Try as best you can not to let the wire brush of doubt scrape from your heart all sense of yourself and your hesitant light. If you remain generous, time will come good, and you will find your feet again on fresh pastures of promise, where the air will be kind and blushed with beginning. Jesus is also with the suffering. On Good Friday, a moving image by Polish Jesuit Wacław Okun circulated on social media. It was a picture of a contemporary Pieta. Rather than Mary cradling the dead body of Jesus, he's being laid down by a team of 5 medics, all wearing masks and gloves and protective gowns. ECG leads are still stuck to his chest, an oxygen mask still over his mouth. There's a crying pain to it all. It's a shocking image, well known but yet unknown. A machine that has recorded the last breath and the last heartbeat now lies silent. And yet there's also a tenderness. Those around Jesus look exhausted, but still go on caring. His right arm slipped to the floor in the most relaxed of ways. It's finished, indeed. Jesus is with those who are suffering. He looked with compassion on the crowd. He wept at the tomb of Lazarus. He confronted a thief crucified next to him. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all consolation, wrote Paul to the infant church in Corinth, continuing, who consoles us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to console those who are in any affliction with the consolation with which we ourselves are consoled by God. I think that the woman who reached out to just touch the hem of Jesus' garment and was made well has something to teach us. He did not need to touch her, nor did he need to touch the centurion's servant at this time when we can't touch people for fear of passing on the virus, when a hug could be a weapon that kills our loved one. Might this story be illustrative to us? Jesus comes close enough, and close enough is enough to receive all that he longs to give us and all that we long to receive from him. And Jesus is with the poor, for he begins so many of his conversations with a question. And isolation is making us as a society begin to ask questions and to have conversations that dare to dream what a post-COVID world might look like, knowing that we will not be going back to normal, but forward into new horizons. Jesus asks us how that future might be, how it might be good news for the lost, the least, and the lonely. How might his beatitudes become real? He asks us, how will we ensure that the poor don't end up paying for it all, as they do too often? How might that future be one where those that Christian Aid seeks to support might begin to flourish, those who are themselves daily on the front line of disease, drought, famine, climate change, and 101 related challenges to get through each day? What from the old ways of living have enabled this pandemic to happen? And how do we change so as to avoid repeating them, just going back to them in the future? Some have called this time a period of exile. Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness, denied access to other people and places of worship. The Israelites, of course, spent 40 years in the wilderness, and during those years they were fashioned into the people God wanted them to be. Through the crucible of suffering, they learnt a new dependency on God and became formed as a nation. Can this current exile enable us to live better for all in the future? And whilst we rightly praise our NHS staff and have tried to keep the curve of the pandemic low and utilised every ventilator so that the NHS can cope, what of those places where there are no such resources? The Central African Republic has just 3 ventilators to serve the entire nation, while South Sudan has only 4. The potential impact of COVID-19 in South Sudan, Syria, Venezuela, and Yemen is massive, where prolonged conflicts and humanitarian crises have left health systems weak and with severe shortages of life-saving equipment. I understand that South Sudan has 24 intensive care beds for a population of 12 million people. The numbers are only marginally better in northeastern Syria, just 28 intensive care beds and 11 ventilators in hospitals identified for quarantine and for COVID-19 patients. What, I wonder, does it mean to be part of a common humanity stretched around the world where we support one another? I think that Jesus would be asking these types of questions. And finally, where would Jesus be? Jesus would be with us all. In this Easter season, I've enjoyed reading yet again the story of the road to Emmaus, of the disciples on that journey. Perhaps they were heading home or going looking for work or fleeing from having been recognized as people associated with the wandering Galilean. Whatever their purpose, theirs was a walk that was laden with bewilderment, disillusionment, and disappointment. These friends were crushed and defeated. Anything that mattered to them has been turned to dust. And yet in the middle of the text are three words that go to the heart of the story. We had hoped. Expectations have been dashed, longings cut short, dreams turned to nightmares. The messianic candle has been well and truly snuffed out, and there's no sign of the promised kingdom. How often, I wonder, in the last few days and weeks, might we have heard ourselves saying, we had hoped. We had hoped to do this, we had hoped to go there, we had hoped to meet so-and-so, we had hoped to be in church by now. Like the two companions, we may be confused, unsure of our bearings, even crushed and defeated. Yet the testimony of so many is that it is at precisely such times as this that Jesus comes and gently bumps along with us. God creates humans for companionship, dialogue, and for sharing. He can't help wanting to walk beside us. God in Jesus is ready to listen to our disillusionment, disappointment, our dismay, and to illuminate our minds with a greater vision. What we discover is that God in Jesus fills every journey with new energy and the possibility of resurrection hope. So what would Jesus do? What do you think? How might the pegs of being with the Father, with the suffering, with the poor, with us all, help you map out your reflections to that question? And above all, find some stillness in this current storm. God bless you.